Cetshwayo's name echoes across time, not merely because he led his warriors in one of the most dramatic clashes of the 19th century, the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, but because his reign became a battlefield not just of soldiers, but of politics, deception, and betrayal. His enemies were not only red-coated British regiments, advancing with rifles and cannons. His greatest threats came from within his own people, from those who bent under the weight of colonial pressure, and from allies who smiled in the light, yet plotted in the shadows. The colonial era was not just an age of conquest. It was an age of manipulation, where empires rarely fought alone. They thrived by dividing kingdoms, by fueling rivalries, and by planting seeds of suspicion that grew into forests of treason. Zululand, proud and defiant under Shaka, Dingane, Mpande, and finally Cetshwayo, found itself caught in this web of imperial ambition. And in that web, the trail was both a weapon and a curse. Cetshwayo's story begins as one of strength. Born the son of King Cempande, he rose not only by the laws of inheritance, but also through force, strategy, and blood. Like his uncle Shaka before him, he understood that power was never given. It had to be claimed. And yet, while he defeated his rivals and unified his authority, he could not silence the whispers of those who doubted him, who resented him, or who sought advantage in the colonial order that pressed upon Zululand's borders. The betrayal of Cetshwayo was not a single moment. It was a series of wounds, each cut deeper than the last. The trail by kin who challenged his authority. The trail by Zulu chiefs who chose personal gain over loyalty. The trail by colonial officials who promised peace but conspired for conquest. And betrayal by supposed allies who abandoned him when the flames of war raged hottest. In this documentary, we uncover the betrayals that shaped Cetshwayo's fate. We will walk through the royal kraals, where power struggles turned brother against brother. We will march with the impis across battlefields like Isandlwana, where glory and doom walked side by side. And we will sit in the silence of exile, where a king once feared by empires found himself betrayed into isolation. This is not just the story of a king. It is the story of a people caught between loyalty and survival, between tradition and the crushing weight of empire. It is the story of Zulu treason in the colonial era, and the lessons it carries still echo in today's world. That betrayal, once sown, does not die easily. Before we uncover the betrayals that shaped Cetshwayo's fate, remember to like this video and subscribe for more powerful history stories. In the hills of Zululand, where rivers cut deep into the land and cattle grazed beneath the sun, a prince was born who would carry the weight of a nation. Cetshwayo kaMpande, son of King Cempande and Queen Nkumbazi, entered the world in 1826, a time when the Zulu still lived in the shadow of Shaka Zulu, the warrior king who had carved an empire with spear and shield. But Cetshwayo's father, Mpande, was no Shaka. Cautious and indecisive, he ruled a nation weary of bloodshed. His caution allowed factional rivalries to flourish at court, where chiefs and princes maneuvered for power. Beneath the surface of his reign, the trail simmered. Cetshwayo stood apart. Tall, broad-shouldered, and commanding, he carried himself with the presence of a warrior. Many said he embodied Shaka's spirit, discipline, strategy, and fearlessness. Yet such strength bred envy. And in the royal house, envy was deadly. The rivalry that defined his rise came from succession disputes. Among Mpande's many sons, 2 stood above the rest. Cetshwayo, respected and strong, and Mbuyazi, younger but favored by kaMpande. That favoritism split the kingdom. In 1856, the feud erupted at the Battle of Ndondakusuka, fought along the Tugela River. Mbuyazi, supported by kaMpande and Natal settlers, faced Cetshwayo, backed by the majority of the Zulu nation. The clash was catastrophic. Thousands perished. Mbuyazi was slain, and his followers slaughtered. Cetshwayo emerged victorious, proving his right to rule. Yet the triumph was bitter. kaMpande had sided against his own son, a betrayal that scarred Cetshwayo for life. Chiefs who had supported Mbuyazi bent the knee reluctantly, their loyalty hollow. When kaMpande died in 1872, Cetshwayo was crowned king. The people celebrated, but colonial officials who attended saw not a partner, but an obstacle. His throne was won by blood and steel, yet the crown he wore was sharpened with hidden daggers. He knew he was not only a Zulu king, he was a sentinel standing between his people and the rising tide of empire. To the north lay the Boers of the Transvaal, to the south and west the British colony of Natal, and from the east came ships of missionaries, traders and soldiers. Zululand was encircled like a tightening noose. The British came with smiles, attending his coronation with gifts and words of friendship. But behind the gestures lay ambition. Zululand was the strongest African kingdom in the region, disciplined, wealthy and proud, and to British eyes it was an obstacle to their dream of a South African federation. No African ruler, however wise, could be allowed to stand in the way of civilization. Cetshwayo was no naive chief. He corresponded with Queen Victoria, declared his wish for peace, and restricted military raids into Natal. He cautiously allowed missionaries while defending Zulu traditions. Yet every gesture of diplomacy was twisted by colonial officials. To London, he was painted not as pragmatic, but as a savage despot. At the centre of this narrative stood Sir Henry Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner. To him, Zululand was a relic of the past. His reports branded Cetshwayo a menace, justifying conquest. His weapons were both the rifle and the pen. But Britain knew military conquest alone would be costly. To weaken Zululand, they encouraged division. Disaffected chiefs were courted, rivals emboldened, and old grievances amplified. When Britain annexed the Transvaal in 1877, Zululand was surrounded by the Union Jack. The stage was set not for peace, but confrontation. Cetshwayo kept discipline, forbidding border raids even under provocation. But restraint was portrayed as weakness. By the late 1870s, it was no longer if Britain would invade, but when. The storm was gathering. Every king fears the betrayal of his enemies. But the deepest wound comes not from those who march openly against him, but from those who share his blood, his table, and his throne room. For King Cetshwayo kaMpande, the greatest cracks in his kingdom came not first from British bayonets, but from the rivalries within the Zulu royal house itself. Cetshwayo had secured his crown at the Battle of Ndondakusuka, defeating his half-brother Mbuyazi and thousands of his followers. That victory had been absolute. So absolute that Mbuyazi and nearly all his brothers who sided with him perished in the blood and mud of the Tugela River. But while the spears of that day secured Cetshwayo's throne, they also planted the seeds of suspicion. Families were shattered, clans divided, and many chiefs quietly mourned the sons and brothers lost in the slaughter. Cetshwayo was king, yes, but he had not inherited peace. He had inherited resentment. Even his father, King kaMpande, had betrayed him by favoring Mbuyazi. Though Cetshwayo's victory made him the de facto ruler long before Kampande's death, the memory of his father's disloyalty lingered. It whispered a dangerous truth. If a father could betray a son, then what of brothers, cousins, or chiefs? Cetshwayo ruled, but he did not rule without watchful eyes upon him. Among the chiefs of Zululand, rivalries festered. Some saw Cetshwayo's rise as the triumph of one branch of the royal family over others. Others envied his charisma, his discipline, his ability to command the impis with the same iron grip that Shaka once held. And some, quietly, began to wonder if they might secure more power by aligning themselves with the white officials of Natal, or with the missionaries who spoke of a different world beyond Zulu tradition. Cetshwayo himself was aware of these undercurrents. He moved cautiously, rewarding loyalists, balancing rival clans, and carefully managing the military regiments that were the beating heart of Zulu power. He tried to keep the system intact, age-grade regiments loyal to the king, bound by honor and tradition. But the cracks widened, as whispers spread that certain chiefs were communicating with Natal officials, undermining his authority behind closed doors. There were also those within his own extended family who saw opportunity in his burdens. Princes who had survived the earlier conflicts remembered the old feuds. Some waited for Cetshwayo to stumble. Others fed the British their grievances, presenting themselves as moderates who could govern better than their king. It was an old colonial strategy: divide and rule, and Zululand was not immune. The betrayal of Kim was not always loud or violent. It came in hesitations, refusals, and small acts of disobedience. A regiment delayed in mustering when called. A chief withheld tribute or cattle. A cousin whispered to a missionary that Cetshwayo was too harsh, too tyrannical, and the words found their way into British reports. In the eyes of the king, such acts were not mere inconveniences. They were fractures that weakened the shield of the Zulu nation, at the very moment empire was closing in. By the 1870s, these divisions began to harden. Some chiefs favored compromise with the British, believing that survival depended on bowing to empire. Others clung fiercely to tradition, urging Cetshwayo to resist at all costs. The king was caught between two fires, trying to preserve independence while maintaining the fragile loyalty of his elites. Yet every disagreement, every hesitation, every betrayal, no matter how small, made his throne less secure. The tragedy of Cetshwayo's reign is that he fought with the strength of a lion against enemies abroad, yet he was forced to fight with equal vigor against betrayal at home. His throne was a battlefield, not only of armies, but of hearts and loyalties. And as history would soon prove, when betrayal festers within, even the mightiest kingdom becomes vulnerable to the strike of an outsider. If betrayal within the royal house cut Cetshwayo deeply, the trail from without would bleed Zululand further still. For while kin could wound his pride, it was the manipulation of allies and neighbors that threatened the very survival of the Zulu Kingdom. The Zulu had long lived alongside Europeans, Boers to the north, the British colony of Natal to the south. At times, these neighbors were partners in trade, at others, rivals for land and cattle. But in the colonial era, alliances were never built on trust. They were built on convenience, bargains, and betrayal. The Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers who had trekked inland during the Great Trek, were some of Zululand's most dangerous neighbors. Fiercely independent, armed with rifles, and determined to carve their own farms into African soil. They clashed with the Zulu more than once. Yet when Cetshwayo rose to prominence, the Boers occasionally presented themselves as friends, trading cattle, negotiating borders, and even supporting rival Zulu claimants when it suited them. Their loyalty, however, was always to themselves. They remembered the humiliations of past battles, and many dreamed of reclaiming fertile Zulu lands. When the British annexed the Transvaal in 1877, the Boers became pawns in a larger imperial game. Suddenly, the entire northern frontier of Zululand was controlled by Britain. For Cetshwayo, this was betrayal on a grand scale. The Boers, once a fractured neighbour, had been absorbed into the empire that now encircled his kingdom. The Zulu king had not only lost a bargaining partner, he had gained another enemy under the Union Jack. Meanwhile, the British colonists of Natal played a subtler but equally treacherous game. Settlers and missionaries spoke of civilization and Christianity, presenting themselves as benevolent guides to a new world. Yet their pens were as sharp as any spear. Reports written by missionaries exaggerated Zulu brutality, portraying Cetshwayo as a tyrant who oppressed his people and threatened colonial safety. Some chiefs who bore grudges against the king whispered into missionary ears, feeding stories that travelled swiftly across the seas to London, where they were used to justify intervention. Even worse, colonial officials courted dissident Zulu leaders, exploiting rivalries to weaken Cetshwayo's authority. A chief passed over for royal favour could find sympathetic listeners in Natal, where promises of recognition and land were quietly made. A prince denied influence could present himself to the British as a peaceful alternative to the king. Every conversation, every handshake, every false promise chipped away at the unity that Cetshwayo needed most. And at the heart of this manipulation stood Sir Henry Bartle Frere. To him, Zululand was not just a neighbour. It was an obstacle to his grand vision of a unified South African federation under British rule. He understood that outright invasion would be costly, but division could achieve what armies could not. His strategy was to provoke, isolate, and weaken Cetshwayo, until the Zulu Kingdom was ripe for conquest. In 1878, Frere issued the infamous ultimatum that Cetshwayo disband his army and accept British authority. It was a demand designed not for peace, but for war. Yet even before the first shots were fired, betrayal had already taken its toll. Allies who might once have stood by the Zulu king were gone. The Boers had been swallowed by empire. Missionaries who claimed friendship whispered poison into British ears. Chiefs who should have defended their king weighed survival against loyalty and began to hesitate. Cetshwayo stood on the brink of the greatest trial of his reign. But as the British prepared to march across the border, the king knew the harshest truth of all. He was not only facing an enemy with rifles and cannons. He was facing an enemy that had already succeeded in turning friends into traitors, allies into spies, and neighbors into enemies. The betrayal of allies was complete. And soon, the betrayal of war itself would follow. The morning of the 22nd of January, 1879, dawned hot and heavy over the plains of Isandlwana. The sun rose over the jagged hill that gave the battlefield its name, casting long shadows across the land. Beneath that hill stood the might of the British Empire. More than 1,700 men, armed with rifles, artillery, and the confidence of an army that had crushed kingdoms across the world. And yet, by the end of that day, the ground would be soaked with British blood, and Cetshwayo's impis would write one of the most astonishing chapters in military history. The Anglo-Zulu War was born, not of Zulu aggression, but of colonial ambition. Sir Henry Bartle Frere had manoeuvred events to provoke war, delivering his ultimatum to Cetshwayo in December 1878. When the king refused to dismantle his army, an army that was the backbone of Zulu identity and independence, the British crossed the border. They came expecting a swift victory, certain that discipline and firepower would sweep aside shields and spears. They underestimated the Zulu nation. At Isandlwana, over 20,000 Zulu warriors, armed with assegai spears and raw courage, descended upon the British camp in a horn-shaped formation perfected by Shaka himself. They moved with silence, then with thunder, overwhelming the redcoats in a storm of steel and fury. When the dust settled, more than 1,300 British and colonial troops lay dead. It was the worst defeat ever inflicted on a modern European army by an indigenous force in Africa. For Cetshwayo, this was both triumph and tragedy. The victory at Isandlwana shook the empire to its core, proving that the Zulu Kingdom was no tribal backwater, but a disciplined, formidable state. Yet the very scale of the victory sealed the fate of his people. The British, humiliated and enraged, would commit themselves to total war. Isandlwana was not just a victory. It was a spark that lit a wildfire of vengeance. Even as his warriors celebrated, Cetshwayo himself wept. He had never wanted a war of annihilation. He had ordered his generals not to cross into Natal, hoping to keep the war contained. But war, once begun, has its own appetite. And in the shadows of victory, betrayal began to stir. At Rorke's Drift, just hours after Isandlwana, a small British garrison of barely 150 men held out against waves of Zulu attacks. Though vastly outnumbered, the defenders survived through discipline, rifles, and luck. The British press seized upon Rorke's Drift, turning it into a tale of heroic resistance that overshadowed the disaster of Isandlwana. For the British public, the war was no longer about imperial greed. It was about avenging the dead. The betrayal of truth had begun. The Zulu cause was twisted into savagery, while British aggression was painted as noble. Within Zululand, betrayal took subtler forms. Some chiefs who had bent the knee after Ndondakusuka now wavered. Victory brought glory, but it also brought fear. They wondered, could the Zulu nation truly withstand the full weight of empire? Whispered doubts became louder, and some chiefs quietly made contact with British officials, hedging their bets for survival. Others dragged their feet when called to muster, weakening Cetshwayo's military strength just when unity was most needed. Worse still, the king's peaceful intent was betrayed by his enemies. Cetshwayo had no wish to see Natal burned or British civilians slaughtered, for he knew such acts would harden the empire's resolve. Yet whenever a Zulu regiment crossed the border without orders, the colonial press declared it proof of Zulu savagery. His discipline, his restraint, his statesmanship, all were ignored, replaced by caricatures of a bloodthirsty despot. The Anglo-Zulu War raged on into the winter of 1879. The Zulu fought with unmatched bravery at Kambula, Gingindlovu, and Ulundi. They bled for their kingdom, for their king, for their freedom. But bravery could not shield them from betrayal. Betrayal by chiefs seeking advantage. Betrayal by colonial narratives. Betrayal by the very allies who promised peace, but sought conquest. When the British finally marched upon Ulundi, the royal capital, the end was written not only in blood, but in treachery. For a king may fight his enemies with spears and shields, but how can he fight the betrayal of his own? On the 4th of July, 1879, the skies over Zululand darkened with smoke. At Ulundi, the heart of the kingdom, the might of the British Empire descended. Lines of redcoats formed an unbreakable square while artillery and Gatling guns spat fire. Wave after wave of Zulu warriors charged with courage, but their spears could not pierce the storm of bullets. By day's end, Ulundi burned, and the fate of King Cetshwayo was sealed. Hoping for peace, Cetshwayo sent envoys, insisting he had never sought war. But the empire wanted no strong Zulu king, especially not the one who had humiliated them at Isandlwana. They wanted division and control. In August 1879, British troops captured him. No trial, no negotiation. Chiefs who had courted colonial officials stayed silent, their betrayal clearing the way for his fall. Exiled to Cape Town's Castle of Good Hope, Cetshwayo became both prisoner and spectacle. Settlers came expecting a brute, but found a dignified, intelligent king who carried himself with sorrow and pride. Even in exile, betrayal shadowed him. In Britain, however, voices rose in his defense. Sympathizers argued he had been provoked and wronged. Their pressure reached Queen Victoria, who allowed him to travel to London in 1882. There, Cetshwayo impressed crowds and dignitaries alike. Dressed in Western attire, yet bearing the pride of his people, he spoke not of revenge, but of peace. For a moment, it seemed justice might be restored. But Britain betrayed him again. Though returned to Zululand in 1883, his power was gutted. The kingdom was split into 13 chiefdoms, rivals empowered and allies weakened. Almost immediately, civil war erupted. Backed by colonial arms, Zebhebu Kamafita attacked Cetshwayo's supporters, burning villages and scattering regiments. In 1883, Zebhebu struck Cetshwayo's kraal at Ulundi. The king escaped, wounded and humiliated, fleeing into hiding. Chiefs who once swore loyalty abandoned him, fearful of British wrath or seduced by rival promises. On the 8th of February 1884, in a kraal at Ishawe, Cetshwayo died suddenly. Perhaps from wounds, perhaps from poison. The truth remains uncertain, but betrayal had hollowed Zululand from within. Exiled, divided, betrayed, Cetshwayo's fate was not just personal tragedy. It was the tragedy of a kingdom undone not only by conquest, but by treason. The death of King Cetshwayo kaMpande in 1884 did not close the Zulu story. It opened a darker chapter. His downfall left not only the loss of a king, but the fragmentation of a nation, once united in defiance. By the time he died, whether from wounds, illness, or poison, Zululand was no longer the mighty force of Shaka's era. It had been deliberately weakened by Britain's divide and rule. The kingdom was carved into 13 chiefdoms, fractures designed to ensure no single leader could rise again. The result was chaos. Rival chiefs fought for supremacy. Villages turned on neighbors, families split, and the disciplined impis dissolved into scattered loyalties. The Zulu army, once feared, was reduced to fragments. Some loyal to Cetshwayo's memory, others to ambitious traitors, The most ruthless was Zibebu Kamafita, armed and supported by colonial authorities. He burned kraals, slaughtered loyalists, and became the enforcer of imperial will. Betrayal had moved from whispers at court to open civil war. Cetshwayo's son, Zulu, tried to restore unity, even allying with the Boers. But promises of aid turned to chains, as land was demanded in return. Once again, allies became oppressors, and the Zulu sank deeper into dependency. Cetshwayo's betrayal was not only personal. It was the betrayal of an entire age. Britain provoked a war it never sought to avoid. The Boers betrayed his heirs. Chiefs betrayed their king for power. Even history betrayed him, casting him as a defeated tyrant rather than a visionary ruler crushed by empire. Yet among the Zulu, memory endured. Cetshwayo became a symbol of defiance, the lion who humbled Britain at Isandlwana. His story warned that unity is fragile, division deadly. His crown was lost, but his legacy was resilience. Proof that betrayal may break kingdoms, but never the spirit of a people.